Looking back on the week that was and forward to the week ahead. It's the Fantasy Football Hustle. Here are your hosts, Brian Drake and Dwain McFarland.
All across the fantasy universe, welcome back to the Fantasy Football Hustle, powered by Pro Football Focus. I am your host, Brian Drake of FightingChanceFantasy.com, and I'm joined, as always, by PFF.com senior analyst, Mr. Dwain McFarland. Now, Dwain, we took a second to catch our breath after the fantasy season ended, and now here we are, knocking on the door of the NFL Combine, and it's time for us to go again in year 5. Count them, 5 of the Fantasy Football Hustle. How the heck are you, my friend?
I'm good, man. Like that just blows me away that we're going into year 5. It doesn't feel like it. Does it to you?
I mean, it's unbelievable. Every year there's a little something that builds and builds and builds. And, you know, we just keep growing and getting better. And our audience out here on YouTube keeps growing with us. And, you know, we're happy you guys are here. We're ready to grind. And tonight we're going to take a look at the 2022 wide receiver class and how they might impact the fantasy landscape this season. You guys might be sitting there saying, guys, why do I care about players that haven't been drafted yet? Well, because if you want to dominate your dynasty rookie draft, your high stakes leagues, or your best ball contest, you're going to need to know and be ahead of the field on who these guys are and how their skill sets will impact their new teams. So for that, we're going to lean on Dwain's work over at PFF.com, which you can read with a premium subscription, and we can save you 25% with promo code HUSTLE. That's all of the excellent NFL draft coverage, including the 2022 draft guide, which we're going to be showing you some of today on the show, the insider info, the fantasy content, so much more. Use promo code HUSTLE and sign up today. And if you like what we're doing, be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel, search Fantasy Football Hustle. We're going to be focusing a lot more on that content over this offseason. All right, Dwain, let's get things started here with an overview of what you looked at while evaluating these college prospects. What was your approach and some of the metrics that you used to come up with your findings?
Yeah, so I mean, some of these things aren't necessarily new, and especially for folks that have been, reading dynasty content. There's a lot of really good content creators, a lot of good folks with projection models and, hit rates, all that sort of stuff out there. So there's a lot of things that, have really been around in the community. Obviously, the number one thing, most people already know this, is really projected draft capital. So for that, I was really just looking at grinding the mocks, which is just a website that folks can go to. If you haven't seen it before, you can go check that out. But it essentially, and you can go back in time and you can look at like how accurate the mock drafts were. You can look at what players moved around on boards, like in previous drafts, all that sort of stuff. So it's pretty cool. So the first thing really is, looking at draft capital. And so if you just think of it from a standpoint of, a top, say for the receivers, did they have a top 6 finish, a top 12 finish in PPR, top 24, or top 36? And so just looking at their first 3 seasons after being drafted, using draft capital alone, going back to 2011, here are the hit rates for for a first rounder to finish inside the top 6, 17% of them did that in the first 3 seasons. If you were a top 12 performer, 24% of the first rounders hit that. Top 24, 48% of the receivers drafted in the first round hit that mark within the first 3 seasons. And then just getting at least one top 36 finish, which would be a wide receiver 3 in a lot of leagues, 62%. The ones we care about more are really the 24 and 12, because those are really the numbers that make the world go round for fantasy. Wide receiver 3s are fine, but much more value, right, with your wide receiver 2s, your wide receiver 1s. So if you look at second round, it goes for the top 12 finishes 24%, which is the same as the first round. If you look at top 24, 45%. If you look at top 36, 55%. But you can, if you want to go check out my Twitter feed, it's got all that, or you can go read the article. But essentially, it just gets less and less and less. The first and second round, you really get the most hits. Third round, you get a drop off. Once you're in the fourth round and on, it's a really low chance of being successful in the NFL, and that's taking nothing else into account. But the idea is you really want to improve. So if you can take that and then you can layer in additional things and you can actually improve, those hit rates, that's what we're trying to do. I mean, it's one way to think about it. But essentially what I did, I spent a lot of time looking through all of this PFF data from college that I haven't necessarily had time to do before. But now that this is my full-time job, it's a lot different. Last offseason, I had, a full-time job in healthcare plus, the family plus working on fantasy football. There's only so much time that you have for fantasy. My wife would probably argue I still spent too much time on that, but I can't help it. I admit, like, I'm addicted, like, to this type of stuff. But so digging into the college data that we have, which goes back to 2014, and so all I started doing was really looking at these same things, these kind of, top 12, top 24, top 36 finishes, and taking some of these different data points that we have for college players and starting to really correlate those to those top finishes. And so there were a couple things that jumped out to me, like, immediately. Something that folks have already known for a long time, right, is really career and best season dominator. So dominator is just taking your market share for receivers of receiving yards and touchdowns. And so they're just like they sound for career or your best season. That's also really what you combine with age to get breakout age. So if you hit like a 20% or 30%, you'll hear people talk about the 20% dominator rating. Then there's the 30%. So Player Profiler uses 20%. RotoViz with Sean Siegel, they use 30%. That was originally from Frank DuPont, the Fantasy Douche, if you guys remember him, in a book that he put out. So you can read more about those if you guys want. But the two things that I really broke into that I haven't been able to use before was yards per route run, and that's a data point that, like, we've seen at the NFL level. We've used it for over 10 years, and it's a sticky stat, meaning it's stable year to year. It's very powerful. So, like, just as a comparison, for example, like if you took wide receiver yards per game, which is pretty good for projecting, how a player is going to do in the future. If you add it to their draft capital, yards per route run is better than that. And the reason I like yards per route run is it's really more of an efficiency metric based on when you would expect the player to be doing something. So it's a lot better than on a per snap basis to me. Because what's not good about it is you can't compare it all the way back to like 2000 because we don't have the data for this, right? But with those things said, looking at it from just the way it works, I like it because you're looking for how does a receiver perform whenever the team is passing the ball, right? So if it's just snaps, it could be a run play. So if you've got a run heavy team, that's obviously that's going to impact, a player. But yards per route run, it kind of levels the playing field for all receivers. You're only being graded essentially for the times that you're running a route. The other thing that's included that's really cool is the explosive rate per target. So basically, if a receiver gains 15 yards or more on a reception, that goes down as an explosive play. So it's explosive plays per target is how I get the rate, which is something that we just really haven't, had to look at in the past. Now, with all of this, like, it's a small sample size because, like, so for example, if you go back to 2014, well, that means, I'm essentially looking at 2018 as being, somebody drafted in 2018, I'm going to have a full career of stats to look at for their college career. But as you go back further before that, you're going to have fallout. So because I'm not going to have the player's freshman year or the sophomore year or junior year. So I only use players that were drafted in 2018 or later. Well, then that automatically limits, like, the number of players you can look at because they at least need 2 to 3 seasons in the NFL to say, okay, did they hit these rates, right? Did they hit top 12, top 24, top 36 finishes? So it's a small sample size. I'm just throwing that out there again. I wouldn't say this is like something like that we think is super predictive, at this point. It's showing, I would say these things are showing promise, but historically, like from an NFL perspective, these are things we've seen work. So I'm excited, about them. So it's really taking all those things and putting them together, and then really looking at these receivers, from that lens, adding those things into draft capital based on where they're mocking right now.
Yeah, and
that was a long answer.
And we're going to talk a little bit about where the guys are being mocked, specifically to the PFF mock draft, because again, we are powered by PFF.com. And, down the line here, I'm sure we'll talk to our good buddy Matt Waldman, and he'll break down a lot of these guys. But, it really does matter where these guys get drafted. I know there's the Stephon Diggs, Antonio Browns of the world that get drafted later, but draft capital matters. When you're doing your rookie mocks and your best ball drafts, and you're getting this kid's drafted in the 4th round. Like, well, chances are, if you get a 4th, 5th round wide receiver, it's probably not going to hit. So let's start things off, though, with Garrett Wilson of Ohio State, because I got a feeling this kid is going to hit. 6 foot 188. He played 3 seasons in Columbus. His final year, he caught 70 balls for over 1,000 yards and 12 touchdowns receiving. Now, he averaged over 15 yards per reception on a Buckeyes offense that also featured fellow elite prospect Chris Olave, who we'll get to in a few minutes, and a kid in Jackson Smith and Jibe, who, when all is said and done, might be the best of all of them. Now, PFF mock has Wilson going off the board at 13 to the Browns. Tell me what put Wilson atop your wide receiver tier.
Well, he is in the top group as far as, expected draft position. If you look at grinding the mocks right now, you've got Garrett Wilson at 17.2, Drake London at 16.6, Treylon Burks at 16.3. So those 3 guys are all just bunched right there together. Mm-hmm. So immediately he's sitting at the top. The folks heard me talk briefly about the numbers as far as draft capital, knowing that that's super important. So that's the first thing, right, for Wilson is just that. So you get that out of the way. And like his career dominator numbers, so basically taking his career yard share plus his career touchdown share, putting them together, it's a 20.2%, which is it's not great. But you have to look at who he plays with. And so when you look at the Ohio State Buckeyes and you look at the receivers that they've had on their teams, and Kevin Cole actually does something really cool with this that I saw last week. And if I had thought about it before, I may add this in next year. But essentially what he does is he basically doubles, I can't remember if it's the career dominator or the season best dominator number, by the number of teammates on the team that are going to be drafted in the top 100 that played with that receiver. So immediately this year, you look at Chris Olave, right? And I don't know if he projects that into next year, right? Because they've got another receiver coming up. It'll be a 1st round pick, most likely next year as well. Yeah. So essentially, instead of thinking of a dominator, of 20%, you'd be looking more at a dominator of 40%. And that's not the exact math because it would be based on who he played with each year. But essentially, if you play with much better talent, that goes into the equation. And so I didn't do the math on that, but just knowing that right in my head, that's definitely factored in here. But the thing that I love most, really about Garrett Wilson, he's very explosive. So he's the 2nd most explosive receiver in the class as far as plays over 15 yards, 27%. First is Jamison Williams. We'll get to him, in a minute.
Another former Buckeye. He couldn't get on the field with Garrett Wilson there.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, it's loaded. Talk about loaded. Like we saw this with Alabama, right, in previous years as well. So the other thing that I really like about Garrett Wilson is just the fact that on a lot of the routes in the areas that the NFL wins today and NFL's passing game, right, it's not like what we used to think about, right? What we thought of as being the prototype receiver 10 years ago was really more the 6'4", 6'5" guy working outside, winning one-on-one contested. Not that those things don't matter, right? Those things can still be important in the league. But if you really look at the routes that the NFL targets the most, I did a study on this, basically looking at, every route that the NFL over the last 3 years has targeted over 7% of the time. It's basically, I just drew a cutoff because then you start getting down these 3s and 2s and 1%ers. And so if you take all the routes that meet that criteria and you put them together, it's the crossing route, the go route, the hitch route, the in route, the out route, and the slant route. And you add those up, and they make up 65% of targets in just those top 6 routes. So looking at, Garrett Wilson, like that's where he wins, is on all of these type of routes. So when I went and studied all the different receivers and what they're able to do, he was number 2. And so I call those staple routes. So those are the routes the NFL uses all the time. He was number 2 in yards per route run across those 6 different routes. So I think that's a positive thing for him. Explosive rate was really good on those. The percentage of targets that he gets on those type of routes, where his targets come from, is really strong on those. So he was really, he stood out, in that way. And so when you watch the film on Garrett Wilson, like he just moves. Player. He moves. No one in this draft class moves like him when I just watch him play. Is he perfect? No, but you can just see like there's more there. He just has so much more to give, like how he can hit all these different gears, set up all of these different routes, instead the subtleties, to his routes. He can set up a double move anytime he wants. This guy like can set up he can layer things on top of double moves. moves. Whereas some of these other guys, like it's really hard for them to get off a double move, but he's got the speed to beat you deep. He's got the speed to make you respect him so he can come back to the ball. And he's really good with the ball in his hands after the catch. So he's a player that in today's league, right, you can use him in any way you want to. So when I think about breadth of application, the ways that a team could come in and use him, like right out of the gate, like you can use Garrett Wilson pretty much any way you want. He's a little lean, but we're seeing receivers, more and more, right, of this mold, this 6 foot 190, 6 foot 185, 6 foot 195. It's becoming more and more the norm because of all the rules in the NFL, right? I mean, you just can't do the things to wide receivers that DBs used to be able to do with all the changes we've had in the rules.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of Calvin Ridley. All these guys kind of look like big, thin track stars. Let's move. We keep moving it along here. The next player in your first tier is Treylon Burks of Arkansas. He played a ton from the slot for the Razorbacks, and he was uber productive there. Burks caught 66 balls for 1,104 yards and 12 total touchdowns. And while I've been hearing some people compare him to A.J. Brown, I've seen other people say he's nothing like Brown, and that Burks won't even translate to an outside receiver at the NFL level. So there's a lot to watch here. He's obviously incredibly shifty, Dwayne, with the ball in his hands. 6'3", 225. That's a lot of man coming at you in the slot to take down. PFF's latest mock has him going to the Saints at pick 18, which will be interesting because they already have a big man that plays the slot in Michael Thomas.
Yeah, Burks is an interesting one, and I understand why folks are kind of I don't know if they're polarized. Like most folks have him in their top 3 or 4, but there are concerns because of what you said. He works inside so much from the slot. 20% of his targets came behind the line of scrimmage last season. So what we don't know, right, is did the team just decide this is an easier way to get the ball to Treylon Burks? And based maybe on the quarterback play they had, it's just easier to try to get him the ball in space, to take the easier throws, those sort of things? Or was it because the coaching staff saw some sort of limitation in Treylon Burks' ability, right, to beat press man coverage, all those sort of things? The sample size is really small on Treylon Burks playing outside, playing against press. But if you want to see him beat press, you can go watch him against Alabama. You can watch him against Texas A&M. He does it against some better competition. There's just not a very big sample size. So I think when you look at Treylon Burks and you think of him as a route runner, he's not there yet, right? If you watch him and Garrett Wilson, you very clearly know you're watching two different prospects. But with Burks, I think if he's probably also the player that I think, I don't want to say he's the most scheme dependent in this class, but his upside, immediate upside, probably is very dependent on where he lands. I do think if you get him in an offense that uses more play action, you let him run the crossers, you let him line up in the slot, you let him run the in-breaking routes over the middle behind play action where he doesn't have to be super precise. He's going to be facing a lot of zone coverage, things like that. You can move him around in the backfield. It's going to become cliche to talk about players like Debo, right? But you could, if you found a coach that would use him in that type of scheme, similar to Debo, get the ball to him in space, which coaches are becoming more and more willing to do that in the NFL. We're seeing more and more passes towards the line of scrimmage. The biggest difference right now for college receivers versus NFL receivers when they make the switch is in college, they see more passes behind the line of scrimmage that when they come to the NFL, those turn to passes between 1 and 9 yards down the field. So you have to be able to be a better route runner. But I am open to him landing on a team where he could see immediate upside because he gets the right offensive mind. We've got half the league basically is modeling their offense after Kyle Shanahan or Sean McVay now. So that could be a positive thing. Defenses obviously are going to start to adapt and figure those things out. But with Burks, I mean, look, you're just getting a size speed freak. And again, we just don't know why they deployed him the way they did at Arkansas. At least I don't, right? I don't get to talk to the Arkansas coaches or the scouts or any of those sort of things. But that would be my first question if I could talk to those coaches. Hey, tell me about how you guys settled on how to use Treylon Burks. Like, where did that come from? Is it from something that was a limitation on his side, or was it really more, this is just the easiest way to do this, and we're going to put our best player in a position to win? I could see it going either way.
I didn't play. My high school football team, we had a kid named Marquise Walker, who some of you old NFL fans remember. Oh, yeah. He ended up being Michigan's all-time leading receiver. He got drafted by the Bucks, and he was a monster. He was about this kid's size. And what we would do is literally the same thing. They would just line him up in the slot, and they would just throw the ball to him as fast as they could, because basically some guy my size, 5'10", 155 is guarding him, and he would just throw the guy to the side and he would go score a touchdown. So, and that's something we have to think about too with college football. And we'll get to it with Drake London in a minute, is a lot of these offenses are real gimmicky. There's nothing the quarterback can do. They're looking to the side. They're holding up 58 different cards with pictures of the Popeyes logo and Otto the Orange on it. And, they're not the most sophisticated offenses, folks. So, and a lot of times there's real bad quarterback play. So, these guys got to make up for that at the next level. And let's keep going with a guy who really had as much talent around him as anybody, anywhere he's been. And that's Jamison Williams. And he's a name you may know because of his electrifying season at Alabama. But you might forget, he was at Ohio State for his first 2 seasons, and he couldn't get on the field because of all the great guys they had in front of him, like Wilson, like Olave, who we'll mention. But landing in Tuscaloosa isn't a bad thing. And Williams really reminded me, Dwayne, of Jalen Waddle. I'm sure he's going to get that comp all the time. He's like this home run hitter, and he's exactly what NFL teams want these days. And speaking of that, in PFF's latest mock, he was being drafted at 15 overall by my Eagles. Now, he's coming off an ACL tear. So tell me more about Jamison, and how do you see him translating to the next level? Really, it's 1 year of good production.
Right. But I do take into account, right? He was at Ohio State, come to Alabama and you immediately get on the field. And he's still going to be young, right? Whenever once we start playing football this next season, he'll only be 21 years old. So he'll be one of the younger guys still in this class. So his breakout still comes, at age 20, which is, about where, you'd like. If you can get one lower than that, that's great. But that's doable, right? That's fine. So I'm not that worried about, the 1 year because of where he had played before. I'm actually pretty excited about him because he is the most explosive receiver in the class as far as, making the big plays of 15 plus yards or more. We won't get to see him run at the combine because of the ACL. So that's going to be a concern. We'll have to monitor that from a fantasy standpoint. But these guys are recovering faster than ever. But you just got to know that from a fantasy perspective, it could be really more of a year or two thing for Jameson Williams. But we don't know that for sure. We just saw Cam Akers come back from a freaking Achilles tear, right? In the same season, after getting injured in training camp. So I still like the age, explosive plays per target, 29%. And then just when you watch him on the field, you watch him get over the top of guys. He's not as consistent, from a route running perspective from what I've watched as Garrett Wilson. But he can do all the things you just talked about as far as, stretching the field, doing things like that. So I love Jameson Williams. I probably rank him higher than most folks. I've got him in a tier above Drake London just because the profile that he has is the profile really that I prefer. And I just think he's got so much upside.
Speaking of Mr. London, he's the next player I want to talk about because he's so polarizing. Now, Drake London from USC in PFF.com's latest mock, they had the 6'5 Trojan coming off the board at 11th overall to the Washington Commanders. That's the first wide receiver being selected. Now, again, take that with a grain of salt. It's one mock draft. I just kind of want to give you guys a feel for where these guys are going off the board. Big body guy, wins a lot of contested balls, but the knock I've read is people aren't sure that he can separate at the NFL level. And that's something I know you've been all over in your time at PFF. So what do you think about London?
I think receivers can win without being big separators, right? We've seen it. If he goes in the top 10 picks, he's going to be a must draft. I just wrote an article today about how you can find value drafting today. It's not good to be drafting this early, ultimately, as far as, if you look at win rates and things like that and best ball. But if you're going to do it, you should really be drafting players that we know are going to move up come May, once the draft happens, and then moving into June, July, August, players that are going to be drafted 2-3 rounds ahead. So Drake London's probably going to be in that group, right? Because where he's being mocked right now, I think it's going to be hard for him to make it outside of the top 20 picks, which means most likely his ADP is going to move up from where it's at today. So I'm not necessarily against Drake London if you're drafting today, but just from a pure prospect standpoint, I do have him one tier below the guys that we just talked about. And a lot of it really comes back to not just the separation, I think that's fine. But like I talked about, where the NFL wants to win, and if you look at the type of routes that the NFL wants the receivers to win on, not necessarily the areas where Drake London, excels. He's good in those areas. He's just not as good in the areas, in those areas as the guys that we've already talked about. So if you look at, his utilization on, really the staple routes and things like that, he's just a little bit lower, and folks they can see that over at PFF if you want to look at all of it. I break it down across the cross and go, hitch and out slants, all of that. You can see the yards per route run, but just overall, as far as London goes, like I like the fact he hit a 32% dominator rating as a 20.1-year-old. So that's really good. But his career yards per route run is a 2.32. So that's the second lowest of like all the guys that I'm looking at.
That's a real wonky offense out there at USC they were running too.
Yeah.
So that could have something to do with it.
Yeah, it could. But at the end of the day, like it's just got to come down to like, we got to use what we have. And I mean, a lot of these guys are facing, wonky offenses. So, his targets per route run are pretty strong. He did well against man coverage, which is nice. Not necessarily from a separation standpoint, but I don't have the best separation data for college. That's why I don't talk about it a ton. Really, all I can tell you is from a target perspective. So you kind of understand how the players win when they're targeted, but it doesn't really tell you like, are they winning all the time? Whereas for the NFL, I have all the route data for all the players all the time. And so you hear me talk a lot more about separation at the NFL level than you hear me talk about it for the college players, other than what I'm able to see on film. The thing I did notice with London on film, and the cool thing about PFF, like one of the many cool things, is we've got a tool where I can go in and actually see all the college tape, and I can immediately narrow it down to man coverage, single man coverage, press, single man coverage, double coverage, zone coverage. I can see it all. And so my first pass through on all these prospects, the easiest way to really, look at them equally is to look at them versus single coverage and just see how are they able to separate. And London was solid in that area, but he wasn't really good at beating, defenders over the top. He was really good on comeback routes, really good on, not necessarily hitch routes underneath the defense, but curl routes. So a little bit same kind of concept, but further down the field. He was good at getting up to the defender and getting them to turn and then being able to come back. But he just really struggled as far as getting over the top. And the problem, a lot of the routes that he wins on the best are not the routes that the NFL teams are using these days. Now, if he finds the right coach, the right quarterback that will use him in the way that he needs to be used, and they see these things, then I think Drake London's still going to be a good player. I just think some of the other guys have a few more outs is the way I like to look at it, as far as being able to fit into multiple types of offenses.
Speaking of guys who can really, pick him up and put him down, Chris Olave from Ohio State. We've already talked about him a bunch here, so let's get him out of the way. He falls into your second tier. This is a kid I've loved watching for a couple of years in Columbus. Now, he's a deep threat. You're kind of classic burner, but he can run a lot of routes, and he can run them well at 6'1", scored touchdowns in 8 straight games in 2020, and PFF sees him being drafted in their latest mock by the Patriots at 21st overall, which would be a godsend to Mac Jones as the weapon he desperately needs on the outside. Interesting kid here in Chris Olave. We kind of know what he is, 6'1", 188. He's going to run. He's going to be just elusive with the ball in his hands. But is he going to get pigeonholed and people are just going to think, he's like just this deep threat guy?
Yeah, I don't think of him as that at all. I think he was probably the most balanced receiver in the class. He's a 4-year player, so he'll be 22.2 years old whenever the season starts next year, but he's still being mocked inside the top 25 picks. So, he's a little after the other guys that we've talked about, but still in a solid position. Career dominators almost at 20%. It's right at 19%, but he's still got a best dominator rating of 33%. He hit his 30% breakout age of 20.2 years old. He hit the 20% breakout age of 19.2 years old. So, he checks a lot of different boxes. He just didn't lead in any one of these categories. But whenever you go watch Olave, he might be the most polished route runner, of the group. He can do a lot of different things. He's pretty nuanced in the way he sets folks up. Not as sudden as Garrett Wilson in his route running, but the subtleties and the way that he manipulates the defender right in the route. ahead of time. If he knows he's got to be breaking outside, he's always setting the defender up inside, and he knows how to handle if he needs to get to the inside, but the cornerback's trying to take away the inside. Like little things you see like that, like he does better than a lot of the other guys in this class. Now, how much of that is just because he gets better coaching versus some of these other guys? Like those are the questions, right, that we just don't know. So it's hard to quantify those things. But if you're looking at the data and then you're putting the film together, like I felt like they told the same story. Like the data says he's a very balanced receiver. When you watch him on film, you thought, wow, like this guy's ready. Like he can play probably in the NFL today. I don't see him quite as a burner as some other people. Like his career explosive rate per target was good, 25%. Not great. Like elite is whenever you get up towards 30%. So Jameson Williams is at 29%. Garrett Wilson's at 27%, but still better than a lot of other guys in this class, right? We'll talk about David Bell in a minute. That's where he struggled. He was only at 19%. Jahah Dotson, only 21%. Wan'Dale Robinson, mostly used around the line of the scrimmage, which is part of why his is lower, but only 19%. So when you look at Chris Olave, he's going to have the draft capital, very balanced player. A little bit older than some of the other guys that are getting taken at the top of the draft.
Yeah, I really loved watching Olave. I think, man, if he goes to the Patriots and he becomes Mac Jones's.
If he goes to the Patriots, we're all going to hate him because we're just going to think, wow, the Patriots can't ever draft a good.
I know he's gonna break the mold. I'm telling you.
I think he would break that mold as well. I agree.
Jahah Dotson, the PFF had one more wide receiver sneak into the first round in their latest mock. So I want to get your take on him. Dotson, Penn State Nittany Lion, they have him going 27th overall to the Tampa Bay Bucks, and they're going to need reinforcements with everybody they're losing. Another really high dominator score guy. So tell us why Dotson landed in your second tier.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the draft capital helped him. If he doesn't get drafted at the beginning of the second round, like he really, I mean, obviously draft capital is going to hurt any of these guys, but if he didn't have that early second round grade, like he was borderline being tier 3 already. And it's yards per route run, 2.11. That's the lowest of all the guys that I've graded of the top 20 prospects. I mean, there's a few guys that were lower. They're going to be drafted, like Ty Freifogel, and if I'm even saying the guys,
God bless you,
name right. There's some guys that are lower, but like of all the main guys, right, that we think are going to go in the top, say 100 picks, top 90 picks, that type area, definitely the lowest yards per route run. Also, only 21% career explosive target rate. Not the worst, but not even not good. That's below average, versus and again, this is based on the data that I've been looking at, which is a bit of a limited sample size. So these numbers could change some over time. That's why I'm not like knocking any of these guys too hard for just one thing. But for Dotson, there were several boxes he didn't check. You mentioned the dominator. His best dominator was 43%. He did that at age 20.5. So that's a real positive thing for him. But he's just a guy that, like, when I watch him, I mean, I like him. I don't love him. When I look at the data, it says, okay. But like if the draft capital slips at all, like he'll slip into the third tier.
5'11", 184 also. I don't love that. Here's a kid I'm infatuated with. I can't wait to see where he goes. And it's David Bell. And there are probably a lot of folks out there, you don't really know him, but if you look at his dominator score, and I'll let you explain all that, he jumps off the page. Played at Purdue with Rondell Moore. And this kid is just a really good all-around player. Led the Big Ten in receptions as a freshman. Was second in the conference as a sophomore and a junior. I think this guy is a day 2 steal for someone. Tell us more about 6'2", 205 David Bell.
Yeah, Bell really, like, he profiles to me as a Z, receiver or a flanker, meaning, the guy that gets to be off the line of scrimmage is going to work more of the underneath intermediate stuff. You could put him in the slot, use him more like a big slot. Where he doesn't really profile well is if you want to use him down the field. Not that he can't win a contested catch or do some of these other things, but really maybe like if we were hoping for the best thing, like someone that worked more like a Michael Thomas did, right? Just more of a rugged inside player, playing against a lot of zone, a lot of motion, ahead of the snap to get him inside on linebackers, safeties, that type of thing. I think that's where David Bell could do really well. I think if someone expects him to be like an alpha X receiver, I don't think that's probably going to work out, but if he can land in the right spot, I think he could be a really nice possession plus type receiver. You mentioned his dominator. Like, he was the youngest guy in this class to hit the 30% dominator hurdle. He hit that at 19.7 years old. But his explosive play rate, per target is only 19%, which was one of the lowest in the class of the guys that are going to be drafted in the top 100 picks. So again, kind of coming up with what I talked about a moment ago. Like, I don't know that the big play ability is there, but I could see him landing in the right offense and someone that's willing to feed him, a lot of tight coverage type targets, and letting him just win with his physicality. I think that's where you could see David Bell be successful. He, the dominator numbers are big, and when he hit those, the breakouts he hit them on, historically those numbers have done pretty well. Again, it's really just the explosiveness that's holding him back for me.
Yeah, and if you loved some of the stuff we put on the screen, folks, that is from the PFF Draft Guide. Go over to pff.com, use promo code HUSTLE. You're going to get Dwain's articles. You're going to get that draft guide. And don't forget, after that, it comes the fantasy football guide, the betting content, the insider info, all the stuff from the combine. Use promo code HUSTLE. Save 25%. Make sure you like this video. Go to our YouTube page. Subscribe. If you're listening on iTunes, leave a good review right there. Pretty good stuff, my friend, for the first one of year number 5. Not bad at all.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it's kind of nice, just because I've been writing about these guys for the last 3 weeks. And so it's just kind of, hopefully I didn't go too long, just show up and throw up. It's kind of how I felt for a minute. But I think it's a pretty solid receiver class. It's not like one of the best classes like we've seen, the class last year obviously was elite. It's not on that level, but there's some depth to this class. And I'm very interested to see, what the landing spots look like, what quarterbacks they get paired up with, what do the depth charts look like, all those sort of things. But just the way it's shaking out, it looks like a lot of these guys are going to be going, top 50, top 60 picks. If you really look at, ADP trends and looking at, some of these guys that'll most likely move a lot, because right now their ADP is not matching with where they're probably going to be drafted based on mocks. The guys I would be telling people to draft the most, that they're probably going to move up the most. And look, if you're drafting right now, these are the players you should be targeting. If you're not, you shouldn't be drafting, because the edge that you get by drafting early, it's, overall it's a losing proposition. But if you're going to do it, if you focus just on really truly trying to get your hands on the players that their ADPs are going to go up, then that would be a reason to draft now. For my portfolio this year, I'll probably draft 10 to 20% of my teams between now and April before the draft. Then I'm going to stop drafting in May, June, July. There's no news. ADP runs stagnant. You're drafting against really good players. I'm going to kick it back off, late July. I'll kind of get my feet wet again, but come August, and then most of my drafts will be in September. But these players I'm going to give you right now, it's coming out in an article tomorrow on PFF, but you guys, since you're part of the Fantasy Football Hustle, I'll go ahead and give it to you. But looking at these guys, Drake London, his ADP is going to go up. Especially on if you guys do FFPC best ball, it's way too low right now. It's a little tougher over on Underdog, but I still think that there's value there. Olave is a guy that right now is definitely being underdrafted. He's going to end up going in the first round. So you can read the article tomorrow, but basically I went back and looked at the last 2 years of ADP and looked at the profiles for the players that rose the most from January until August as far as ADP goes. And a lot of them were rookies that were already being mocked accurately, but for whatever reason, the community hadn't picked up on it yet. And then when the draft actually happened, they're like, oh, okay, yeah, I guess he actually is going to be a top 15 pick. And then it's too late, because the market will move the very next day. It will be off and it'll be running. So you got to do it now. So Drake London is definitely one of those guys. Garrett Wilson is one of those guys. Not even receivers, just looking at the running backs. I'll give you a few of those too, just because we're talking about the hustle here. So my number one priority right now, if I'm drafting, is Kenneth Walker. He's mocking as the first running back to go off on grinding the mocks. He's mocking right now at pick 57. Isaiah Spiller's pick 65. Kyron Williams pick 75. So for running backs, essentially, you want guys going in the top 90. There's been a few guys outside of that have made big moves. Last year, Michael Carter at pick 104 made that move. But the guys I just gave you, like, they're for sure going to go up in ADP. Isaiah Spiller in FFPC is already at a 70, but over on Underdog, he's a 101. Kyron Williams is if he goes inside the top 75 picks right now, he's 155 at FFPC, 129 on Underdog. Like, so those guys are all going to move up. Tyler Algier, if he runs well, like, he's going to move up in draft capital. You can get him essentially for free at FFPC right now. You can get him at pick 265. So those are the things you got to be thinking about. If you're doing your best ball drafts today, you should be building your strategy around pounding these rookie tiers, knowing where they're going to go, making a plan for them, and then backing into the way you're going to handle your early rounds based on knowing that you're making it a priority to be drafting these type of players. And the thing is, even if you miss on them, it's still the ideal time to draft these guys, because we're not going to be right about them all anyway, right? But right now you're getting the lowest price you're going to get on a lot of these guys all season.
Absolutely. And we're going to come back all off season long. We'll hit you on the running backs, the quarterbacks, I'm sure. Get our buddy Matt Waldman in here, talk some dynasty, best ball. Got a lot of fun stuff lined up for you. Just make sure you're subscribed on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts, and you can find The Hustle. So for Dwain, I'm Drake. Check us out on Twitter. We'll see you next time, folks. Remember to never get out hustled. See you later.